started today. Thanks very much for being here on a beautiful Corvallis afternoon for the beginning of what I hope will be some great sessions on American diplomatic and military history. We're starting off in the 19th century, but I'd like to say a few plugs first. So we've got some great flyers if you want a discount on the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Military and Diplomatic History. 20% off plus $100 off. So you're getting it for somewhere in the 100, 150 range if you use these. And you get this gorgeous 2-volume set. Will come in very handy, 1,500 pages, hundreds of entries, some of them authored by those of us present in the room, all experts in the field. So I have the great honor and privilege of introducing Danielle Holtz. She is an ABD in U.S. History at the University of Pennsylvania, where I had the pleasure of working with her a bit, and also working with her as assistant editor on the book project. She studies military, diplomatic, and intellectual history, specializing in transnational work and the U.S. role in the world. She works with Walter McDougall, an eminent figure in the field. And she's currently working on a dissertation which I think will be groundbreaking on conservatism and conservative thought and language in transnational political discourse, looking both at the 19th and at the 20th century. She's currently a board member for Reacting to the Past History Pedagogy, and she has won lots of awards. To name just a few, she's been a Benjamin Franklin Fellow, she's been a William Lengelbach Fellow, a Jack Miller Center Fellow, she just received a Bradley Foundation Fellowship, and I could go on. She's also actively engaged in lots of congressional record research, which is something that we share, trying to get through those volumes. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. So please help me welcome Danielle Holtz.
Thank everyone for having me here, and thank Chris for inviting me to work on the Encyclopedia and entering this whole world of editing. It's been really incredible. So my paper is titled Stat Nominis Umbra, Standing in the Shadow of a Name, the Monroe Doctrine and the Impact of European Revolutions on American Political Discourse. If we were to imagine an inquiry into the Monroe Doctrine, for instance, at the outset of a conference launching the Oxford Companion to American Military and Diplomatic History, we might expect to first turn to its origin. In this case, President James Monroe's 7th annual message delivered to Congress on December 2nd, 1823. From these 6,356 words, we might pull a few lines that give voice to the key principles identified with the doctrine. First, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. And second, that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and security. For ease, we might summarize Monroe's message as opposing all new European interference in the Western Hemisphere. We would likely note that 22 years passed before a president, in this case Democrat James K. Polk of Tennessee, made the Monroe Doctrine a cornerstone of his foreign policy, alluding to it in his 1845 inaugural, his annual message of that year, and his missives to Congress on the 1848 French Revolution and the 1848 Yucatan Revolt against Mexico. We might then use these principles as a metric to measure American foreign policy, classifying which administrations could be characterized as following the Monroe Doctrine. In this frame, we would judge the Monroe Doctrine as active only when America successfully opposed European interference and asserted its dominion over the Western Hemisphere through diplomatic, economic, or even military intervention. As a result, we would have conveyed a clear meaning to the doctrine and demonstrated its application or lack thereof in American foreign policy. This approach functions to create order out of the mess of 19th century diplomatic history, but it forecloses two avenues of inquiry essential to illuminating American foreign policy in this era. First, Identifying the key principles from the source text occludes contested meanings. In the 19th century, statesmen used the Monroe Doctrine positionally instead of referentially, signifying, depending on the speaker, intervention or non-intervention, belligerence or neutrality, expansion or stasis, and sometimes even referred to Monroe's position on fiscal policy, internal improvements, and the veto power as the Monroe Doctrine. Second, focusing on the doctrine as a feature exclusive to American diplomacy categorically disregards its function in domestic as well as foreign policy debates and reinforces a false binary between the domestic and the foreign, which limits our ability to understand antebellum American politics, its discourse, and its dynamics. The nominal debate over the Monroe Doctrine in this period reflected a speaker's position on the role of history and the role of precedent in American foreign policy, the role of the executive and legislative branches in shaping, determining, and articulating that policy, and the role of governments and individuals in forming and reforming their political, ideological, and geographic landscapes. The Civil War dwarfs the geopolitical and social landscape of the 1850s, and if histories tend to frame all political debate as returning to the lodestone of slavery, it's probably because it did. The excitement of the Mexican-American War having worn off, statesmen turned inward to fight over the peculiar institution of slavery, a conflict that repeatedly turned violent. These domestic disputes internal to the United States seem beyond the purview of American diplomatic history. As a result, the period between the Mexican and Civil Wars can read like a diplomatic dead zone, punctuated by a list of treaties and several failed attempts to buy Cuba. But placing the Monroe Doctrine at the center of this frame reorients the view and blurs the seemingly intractable lines between the foreign and the domestic in this period. In the decade after Polk invoked the Monroe Doctrine to support its 1848 foreign policy initiatives, American statesmen wrangled over its meaning, validity, and application. The key terms relevant to the Monroe Doctrine's foreign policy implications, state sovereignty and non-intervention, also demarcated the fault lines in American domestic policy, which meant that these arguments inflected the debate over interstate as well as international politics. In that sense, the discourse around the Monroe Doctrine did not merely stand in for antebellum debates over slavery or provide another battleground for the major factions to work out their arguments, but it also shaped the conversation in ways that implicate the structure and dynamics of the Civil War and of the post-war United States. Luckily, both of those are beyond the purview of this paper. In the interest of time, I'll lay out a few key examples of how the Monroe Doctrine failed to cohere around a single set of principles or meanings and touch on the conjunction of the foreign and domestic in American political discourse in this decade, starting with 1848, James K. Polk and the Yucatan Peninsula. On April 29, 1848, President Polk set off a firestorm when he laid out a message before Congress calling for intervention on the Yucatan Peninsula on behalf of its white population, who had requested protection from Native Americans pursuing a war of extermination against them. Invoking the established policy, his words, set out in Monroe's 1823 message, Polk suggested that Congress consider measures to aid, occupy, or even annex the Yucatan Peninsula, lest some European power assert a claim to dominion and sovereignty over it. The discussion that followed quickly devolved into a heated dispute over the nature of the Monroe Doctrine itself, what it originally meant, whether it accorded with America's fundamental principles, whether it constituted sound foreign policy in this particular instance, whether it ever constituted sound foreign policy, and whether the situation in the Yucatan justified its application. Luckily for the Senate, Democratic Senator Edward Hanigan of Indiana had spoken to the doctrine's author, John Quincy Adams, weeks before he died of a brain hemorrhage on the floor of the House on February 21st, 1848, just 10 weeks before this debate. A month before Adams died, Hanigan said, inspired by the Declaration's true and lofty patriotism, he sought an interview with that venerable man in order to make some inquiries in relation to this very subject. this might actually mark the first time that a Democratic senator has referred to John Quincy Adams as a venerable man. 25 years earlier, Monroe had sought out Mr. Adams for his opinion on what duty was implicated by the gratifying changes upon this continent. Monroe, impressed by Adams's principled response, asked him to reduce it to writing, the text of which he then incorporated, nearly verbatim, into his annual message. It's water. Hanigan asked Adams, "Was it meaningless?" "No," he replied. "It was fraught with meaning and intended to convey all that it expresses." And Mr. Adams added that neither the senator from South Carolina, Calhoun, nor any other member of the cabinet heard of it until he heard it read in the message. He then asked, "Did it mean that we should appeal to arms?" "No," was the reply. "That when an attempt of this kind was made, we should first resort to negotiation and exhaust it. A negotiation having failed, it would then be time to consider the question of peace and war, which would depend entirely upon the importance of the object." Now, Edward Hanigan was a drunkard addicted to morphine who murdered his brother-in-law, but the speculative veracity of his tale matters less than the mere fact of its telling. For Hanigan, the story served two main purposes. It marked him as the putative authority on the Monroe Doctrine, having received the mantle from its author, and it explicitly wrote the sole surviving member of Monroe's cabinet out of the narrative. If Senator Calhoun, the senator from South Carolina, had no hand in writing Monroe's declaration in 1823, then he had no special insight into its meaning and no particular authority on which to oppose intervention in the Yucatan on the grounds that it violated Monroe's doctrine. In positioning himself as the arbiter of the doctrine's historical meaning, Hanigan made an implicit statement about the role of history in the construction of authority and authenticity. In citing John Quincy Adams 10 weeks after he died, 10 weeks after he suffered a major hemorrhage on the congressional floor, opposing everything for which Hanigan and the other interventionists stood, he made a similar statement about the role of death in the availabilities of figures to act as signifiers of that authority. Still, even with the author's authority, Hanigan failed to say anything more substantive about the Monroe Doctrine than it intended to convey all that it expresses. This vacuous phrase either speaks to his paucity of imagination, or it supports the argument that Monroe Doctrine served as an empty letter, at least in part because the text itself conveyed very little substantive meaning. If Hanigan hoped that invoking Adams's ghost would staunch the debate on Monroe's meaning, his fears quickly disabused him of that notion. Senator Hale from New Hampshire characterized Polk's desire to intervene in the Yucatan as a wild, quixotic scheme, entirely at variance with the institutions of the country. That the principle avowed by Mr. Monroe never was and never could be the policy of the United States in the sense which Mr. Polk conceived it. Such interference would violate Washington's dictum about entangling alliances with none, and entrenching the United States in a humanitarian intervention in Central America would have a much more serious consequence for the interests of the oppressed of all climes, who anxiously looked to America's beacon light and relied on America's domestic progress to cheer them in the desolation of their despair. The same motives of humanity impelled Democratic Senator Sam Houston of Texas to sidestep Hanigan's push for negotiation and instead to call on Congress for a swift show of force in the Yucatan. Either the Monroe Doctrine meant something or it meant nothing. And for it to mean something, the United States must forcefully occupy the peninsula before the European powers beat them to it. Both Connecticut Whig John Davis and cast iron Democrat John C. Calhoun, whom Hanigan so ignominiously dismissed in his narrative, relegated Monroe's message to a particular historical moment, when the Holy Alliance combined in 1815 to reclaim the colonies lost during the chaos of Napoleon's wars. Davis dismissed the declaration of Mr. Monroe as mere executive opinion and nothing more. Having performed its office, which amounted to nothing, as it was obligatory upon nobody, it was substantially, in 1826, obsolete. Until, that is, Polk dug it up, breathed into it new life. It had been dead, buried, and forgotten. His But as Europe confronted the political fallout of the 1848 revolutions, forcing American statesmen to consider America's role in supporting Republican independence in the other hemisphere, the doctrine continued to gain traction. When Hungarian revolutionary Louis Kossuth landed on American soil to drum up support for Hungarian independence from the Austrian Empire, he sparked a series of congressional resolutions that forced American statesmen to directly confront the questions raised by the Monroe Doctrine's resurrection. In the time that had elapsed since Polk's administration revivified the Monroe Doctrine, it figured largely in the debates over American diplomacy, most vociferously over the 1850 Anglo-American Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, establishing a shared Anglo-American approach to Central America. The doctrine also remained intimately associated with American incursion into the Southern Hemisphere, with expansionists such as the outspoken Michigan Senator Lewis Cass leading the charge. In fact, the Monroe Doctrine became so closely identified with Cass in that period that other senators jokingly apologized when they commented on it in his absence. In late 1851 and early 1852, Louis Kossuth delivered a series of talks encouraging the United States to intercede on Hungary's behalf against the Austrian Empire and Russia's bloody intervention to reestablish Austrian control over Hungary. In his lectures, Kossuth distinguished Washington's doctrine of neutrality from the subsequent American impulse toward isolation, arguing that Washington's farewell address presented a policy of unilateral action, not non-interference in foreign affairs. A week after Kossuth addressed Congress at a banquet in his honor, John H. Clark, a Whig from Rhode Island, presented a series of resolutions to the Senate mediating America's commitment to standing aloof from European affairs and a liberal interpretation of Monroe's dictum to become involved with European powers only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced. Industrialization, increased reliance on international markets, and a huge influx of European immigrants meant that American commercial and social institutions had become much more intimately interconnected with Europe since Washington, Jefferson, and Monroe affirmed their aloofness from that hemisphere. Although Clark's first 4 resolutions affirmed the advice given as a principle of international action in Washington's farewell address to avoid interweaving America's destiny with that of any part of Europe, or entangling American peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, and caprice, and Jefferson to pursue equal and exact justice to all men without entering into entangling alliances, he went on to state that although we adhere to these essential principles of non-intervention, whenever provident foresight shall warn us that when our own liberty and institutions are threatened, then just regard to our own safety will require us to advance the conflict rather than await the approach of the foes of our constitutional freedom and human liberty. New York Whig William H. Seward proposed to strike out this last resolution in favor of a direct statement of American interest when foreign states or nations established a government against the consent of the people, and explicitly tied these resolutions to a condemnation of the Russian Tsar for invading Hungary and, by fraud and armed force, subverting its right to national independence. He said, "In defense of their own interests and of the common interests of mankind, the United States solemnly protested against this wanton and tyrannical infractions to the laws of nations, and do further declare they will not hereafter be indifferent to similar acts of national injustice, oppression, and usurpation whenever or wherever they may occur." I'm going to read that last line because it's very important. The United States solemnly protested against this wanton and tyrannical infraction to the laws of nations, and do further declare they will not hereafter be indifferent to similar acts of national injustice, oppression, and usurpation whenever or wherever they may occur. Southern Democrats heard in this the language of the abolitionist press in the 1850s. Cass warned against the impulse towards public morality embedded in Seward's statement opposing national injustice. subtly identifying Seward's position with the abolitionist movement for which public morality had become a byword. Instead, he reaffirmed the right of nations to manage its own internal affairs in its own way and to alter or abolish its government at pleasure without the interference of any other power. In his version of this resolution, he expressed deep concern over the violation of this principle of national independence, practicing the arguments he would make about popular sovereignty and non-intervention in the domestic institutions of the territories over the next several years. Still, Cass walked a fine line between supporting an argument for federal non-intervention in the governments that American citizens were establishing in the territories and undermining his own stance on expansion. To that end, he mediated his position on two fronts. While declaring his belief in the right and in the capacity of man for self-government, he also maintained that man was not everywhere prepared for institutions like ours, opening the door for American involvement with internal affairs of nations still unprepared for self-government. As well, if declaring foreign nations' inviolability supported American material interests, then such a statement became a question of expediency and not of principle. In the congressional debates on the question of non-intervention that followed these resolutions, the Senate failed to reach any common understanding of the Monroe Doctrine, and the debate over non-intervention demonstrated the North-South fissure within the Democratic Party. In fact, their stance on intervention and whether or not they viewed the Monroe Doctrine as interventionist determined where they stood on the Monroe Doctrine. And when we hit the question-answer period, if you want me to give you the specific details on who voted for what and why, please ask. As the Omnibus Compromise of 1850 broke down in the early part of the 50s, Cass increasingly urged Congress to adopt the twin policies of popular sovereignty and non-intervention in the territories. Several senators noted the connection between Cass's arguments on non-intervention and his stance on the Monroe Doctrine, and in fact brought out what they saw as a contradiction between the two. Senator Harlan of Ohio, in 1854, on the Nebraska and Kansas bill, said, "It is a little remarkable that the distinguished author, inventor, or discoverer of this great doctrine of squatter sovereignty was, for some 15 or 20 years, acting as governor of the territory of Michigan under a law of Congress, and who has been and still is the steadfast defender of the Monroe Doctrine, which asserts that it is our right and duty to protect and defend the governments of the entire continent of America against the efforts of monarchy to control them, when the doctrine of squatter sovereignty and congressional non-intervention would leave a territory of the United States, the very soil of which was purchased by the money of the people, to be settled wholly by a foreign population, who could set up any kind of government that might see proper, and never ask admission into the Union. If Congress cannot constitutionally govern the territories, it would appear to be very certain they cannot confer that power upon others." I'm sorry, how much time do I have left? In this period, the Monroe Doctrine continues to be fraught with meaning. In 54, when there's the debate over the Kansas-Nebraska bill, in the continued arguments over the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, and towards the end of the decade as the run-up to the Civil War begins. In 1854, Mr. Smith, who's a free soiler from New York, on the Mexican Treaty says that the Monroe Doctrine is utterly empty of truth and full of arrogance and bravado. Taking a firm anti-Monroe Doctrine stance, he said that this fatal war with the cornerstone doctrine that every people is at liberty to choose their own government might essentially undermine the strength of the Union in the United States. On the other side of the argument, the Democratic Party, and particularly Southern Democrats, noted that the 1850 Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had certain implications for free soil territory. Senator Butler said, "Gentlemen with all their enlarged philanthropy and patriotism may talk of bringing into the embrace of the Republican free soil territory Canada, the Rocky Mountains, and Mexico into the bargain. But, sir, you'll find that God alone can govern this earth. It's not permitted for man to extend his jurisdiction beyond a very limited sphere, and I believe that no jurisdiction beyond a very, and I believe that no civilization will approach so high as that which is exerted with intensity and within a jurisdiction controllable by human reason. By the end of the decade, the doctrine still clung to life, although without any clarity or consensus on its meaning. In a December 1858 discussion over the Clayton-Bowler Treaty, Mr. Mason of Virginia said, "One thing is very certain. If that treaty is abrogated, it will place the two countries precisely in the condition which they stood before the treaty was made, and it will bring up that vague and so far undefined doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine. And it will devolve upon the country either to maintain that doctrine and to carry it out or to repudiate it." To which Mr. Collamer, the Republican from Vermont, said, "And especially to define it." To which Mr. Mason replied, "And to define it, of course, because we could not maintain it until it was defined." Later that day, the Democratic senator from North Carolina, Senator Clingman, said, "Senator Mason seems disposed to alarm us with the idea that we should have to define and carry out the Monroe Doctrine. I do not profess to understand it, nor do I care what it is." This conflict over the Monroe Doctrine required the United States to engage This conflict over whether the Monroe Doctrine required the United States to engage material intervention, or what precisely it did require, did not resolve in the 1850s. So long as the Monroe Doctrine continued to be implicated in American domestic politics, it could not be active as a doctrine in American foreign politics. This analysis speaks to a larger point about the concept of doctrines in American political discourse. Doctrines are meant to act as reference for a set of ideas or opinions on a specific question, but our inquiry into the Monroe Doctrine reveals the opposite, that identifying a doctrine unsuccessfully obscures its tentative, contested, and highly fungible content. Doctrines only function as reference that signify particular policy aims and attitudes once people no longer remember the messiness and complexity of its origin. Only after the texts have been washed clean of the tumult of the debates that challenge them as doctrine can they successfully be incorporated as key points in policy directives. 50 years lapse between Polk's resurrection of Monroe's doctrine and its relatively less controversial use in supporting the Spanish-American War in 1898. In the intervening time, the doctrine lost the tumult, discussion, and debate that characterized its early usage. This conclusion opens a particular paradox for the editors of an encyclopedia, because only once a source has been cleansed of its multiple and contested meanings can we use it as a source to define a doctrine. When the language loses its poetry, its ambiguity, when it enters common discourse, basically when it becomes a dead metaphor, only then can it be used as a cornerstone of American foreign policy. Thank you.